The Subcommittee on Investigations and Oversight for the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the hearing at any time. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's hearing entitled Environmentalism Off the Rails, How CARB Could Cripple the National Rail Network. I'd like to begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to thank everyone for being here and to our ranking member for being here for what's, for me, a very important hearing. The purpose of our hearing today is to discuss a proposal by the California Air Resources Board that could cripple the national freight network. The Air Resources Board, which we call affectionately CARB for short, is seeking a waiver from the EPA that would require all locomotives manufactured after 2035 that travel through the state of California to operate in a zero emissions configuration. Now, the idea of zero emissions locomotives sounds very supportable, certainly does to me. Unfortunately, though, the technology to actually accomplish this does not currently exist. In fact, there are actually many who doubt it could ever be achieved. Even if this technology became feasible, we are decades away from making zero-emission locomotives a reality in the freight rail industry. Currently, the vast majority of freight rail moves by diesel-electric trains, which convert mechanical energy from diesel engines into electrical power that moves the wheels and propels the train down the track. Because diesel is 27 times more energy dense than a lithium battery, a typical diesel-electric train can convert 5,000 gallons of diesel into 100 megawatt hours of energy. Meanwhile, the largest, most powerful train battery technology commercially available today holds only between 5 and 8 megawatt hours of energy. That means that CARB is expecting the rail industry to invent a battery that can hold up to 20 times more energy capacity than currently exists, and then mass produce that technology and include it on every train in the nation within the next 6 years. Now, to be clear, I am certainly not saying that industry shouldn't strive to make our freight network cleaner, and I consider myself an environmentalist, and I think most of us on the dais would make that same statement. But to impose an arbitrary deadline that is not supported by science shows that CARB has abandoned its mission to protect Californians from harmful air pollution to instead support unrealistic, idealistic policies. Worst of all, to me, CARB's zealous actions are threatening to derail years of progress made by railroads to reduce emissions. Through decades of investments and billions of dollars in research, the rail industry can now move 2,000 pounds of freight 450 miles on a single gallon of diesel fuel. The rail industry continues to make investments to reduce emissions and other particle contaminants through technologies such as positive train control and trip optimization. As a result, trains today account for less than 0.5% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Even considering only the transportation sector and only transportation-related emissions, rail accounts for less than 2%. Unfortunately, imposing this harsh and unrealistic regulation will likely have an effect counter to the goal of this regulation and of CARB's mission. If the EPA allows CARB to implement this proposal and the rail industry is unable to meet the impossible demands, we will likely see a shift in modal transportation where all freight is no longer moved by rail but is instead transported via trucks within the state of California. Unfortunately, heavy-duty trucks, which currently account for 23% of emissions, would then become the primary means of freight transport in California. Transporting freight by truck emits roughly 3 times as much greenhouse gases as transporting it by rail. This shift would undeniably result in a massive increase in greenhouse gas emissions, which is the exact opposite of what CARB claims this regulation is meant to accomplish. CARB also wants to ban the use of any locomotive that's 23 years of age or older. Buying a locomotive is not like buying a car. The average Class 1 freight locomotive has a service life of 40 to 50 years. Locomotives are multi-million-dollar investments that only make sense if used for extended periods of time, similar to an aircraft or a large container ship. For many short-line railroads in my state, buying new locomotives is simply not an option, and forcing them to do so means they will have to simply cease operations. California knows this and even admits it. In the proposed regulation, CARB states that some smaller Class 3 locomotive operators will face significant compliance costs and projects that it will likely lead to their elimination if they are unable to offset them. And unfortunately, the negative downstream effects of this regulation won't be confined to my state of California. The supply chain implications for this proposal could be far larger. We all remember the supply chain nightmares that our country experienced several years ago, when over 70 container ships were anchored off the coast of California, waiting for space to open in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. This event caused a supply chain disruption that was felt nationwide. But if this waiver is granted, the new CARB rule could create another similar situation with millions of tons of goods waiting to be moved from ships onto trucks instead of trains because CARB decided to ignore science and plain common sense. Except, unlike the previous disruption, this one would be permanent. The House Science, Space, and Technology Committee is meeting today to talk about science and technology. We're here to analyze where the science and technology of rail is currently at and what steps can be taken to reduce emissions and other particle pollutants in a smart and responsible way. So I want to thank you all for your willingness to be here to discuss this critically important topic. I'd now like to recognize Ranking Member Fushi for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Obernolte, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today. Since joining the Science Committee, it has been my privilege to participate in hearings that have showcased the very best of the committee's mandate to lead the way in advancing the breakthroughs and innovations of the future. This committee works best when we set aside narrow and parochial thinking in favor of a broad and forward-looking perspective that allows us to dig deep into solutions to pressing scientific challenges. With that in mind, I feel compelled to note that the subject of today's hearing has virtually no connection to the Science Committee's jurisdiction. We're here to discuss an environmental regulation at the state level that is directed at freight rail operations, none of which falls under the committee's purview. It is my hope that after today's hearing concludes, we will refocus on the challenges and opportunities facing the federal research enterprise. Still, I will always accept the opportunity to discuss the path forward for a low-carbon future and the health risks faced by environmental justice communities. Diesel-powered freight rail operations are a significant source of air pollution, a notable contributor to climate change, and a major environmental hazard for frontline communities located around major rail yards. The state of California, as a part of its obligation to provide clean air to its residents, aims to reduce these harms with the in-use locomotive regulation. The rule requires the freight rail sector to adopt cleaner locomotive technologies in the coming decades, and it seeks to advance a transition to zero-emission rail operations that would mirror America's broader shift to a clean energy future. Fortunately, the state's action rests on a solid foundation in terms of public health, cost-benefit analysis, and technical feasibility. The in-use locomotive regulation would have sweeping public health benefits. According to CARB's modeling and analysis, the rule would reduce statewide locomotive emissions by approximately 7,400 tons of particulate matter and 386,000 tons of nitrogen oxide between 2023 and 2050. It would reduce greenhouse gas emissions from locomotives by 21.6 million metric tons. It would reduce hospital admissions and emergency room visits and lead to 3,200 fewer premature deaths. It would even reduce the cancer risk for communities located around major rail yards by over 90% by 2045. These statistics translate to real cancer rate droppings, real lives saved, and air that will be cleaner and healthier for millions of Americans. And despite the predictable complaints from industry, there is every reason to believe that decarbonizing the rail sector is realistic and achievable. We don't have to take CARB's word for it. An independent, peer-reviewed 2021 study led by researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory made a similar finding, concluding that in the near future, battery electric trains can achieve parity with diesel electric trains nationally in terms of cost. Based on their analysis, these independent researchers further concluded that retrofitting diesel electric locomotives with battery electric technology could save the U.S. freight rail sector billions of dollars while yielding environmental, health, and grid resilience benefits. Thus, the argument that zero-emission alternatives will not be available and that their adoption would be prohibitively expensive does not appear to reflect the best available science. I hope today's discussion keeps in mind that real lives are at stake in the transition to cleaner freight rail operations. Frontline communities should not be forced to sacrifice their health and their lives because others are reluctant to invest in the technological solutions made available by a clean energy future. And Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Well, thank you very much, Ranking Member Fucci. I'll now recognize the Ranking Member of the full committee, Ranking Member Lofgren, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman Obernolte, for this opportunity to discuss how our shared home state of California is working to protect the health of our constituents. While this is not a typical Science Committee hearing, I'm glad it offers me a chance to welcome Alan Abbs from the Bay Area Quality Management District. He and his colleagues work hard to address harmful air pollution, including eradicating the use of leaded aviation fuel in my district and beyond. California has unique challenges that worsen our air quality. We have major ports, increasingly intense wildfires, and stunning California geography, which leads to an accumulation of pollution in mountain valleys. These obstacles are why the Clean Air Act allows California to seek waivers to go above and beyond federal standards to improve the state's air quality. In November, EPA issued a policy change that explicitly allows California to seek an EPA waiver to issue locomotive-specific regulations. As EPA explained in its notice, this policy change aligns with the legislative intent of the Clean Air Act. I was glad to see this because if California can't regulate locomotives, it leaves a huge gap in the protection of frontline communities. According to CARB's analysis, the regulation we're here to discuss today will reduce cancer risk around rail yards by an estimated 90%. It will result in 1,500 fewer emergency room visits and 3,200 fewer premature deaths. Beyond those health benefits, this policy makes sense in cost-benefit terms. CARB estimates that the monetized health benefits outweigh the equipment and labor costs by over $18 billion. That's a reflection of just how much the public would benefit from the shift to zero-emission rail alternatives in freight operations. Now, any regulation that changes the status quo is going to demand some upfront costs, and it's not surprising to see resistance from the railroad industry. Fortunately, there's good news for them on the affordability issue coming from just outside my backyard. As the ranking member has mentioned, researchers at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab led a recent analysis that concluded the switch from diesel to battery electric locomotives could save U.S. freight rail sector not just a lot of money, $94 billion over 20 years in sector-wide net present value. And this technology is not pie in the sky. Commercial availability is projected within the next 10 years. CARB took that timeline into consideration when choosing to phase in the requirements with milestone options available through 2047. I'd also note that California is moving the trucking industry also into zero emissions. Now, the science behind the public health benefits is clear. This regulation will save lives, and I hope EPA follows the science in its consideration of granting the waiver. This is also a topic with a lot of exciting technology to highlight. The regulation is going to spur adoption of state-of-the-art zero-emission locomotives, as well as Tier 4 technologies that have been available for a decade. All of these modern alternatives are a drastic improvement over diesel engines, some of which have been chugging through our community, emitting harmful exhaust for half a century. So I thank the chairman for this hearing. I thank the witnesses for their participation. I look forward to their testimony, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Lofgren. So obviously we have a difference of opinion on this topic, and that's why we have our expert witnesses here to help us navigate that, and we're going to do that in a respectful and inclusive way. I did, however, want to briefly address the issue of jurisdiction before we get into the testimony, since our witnesses aren't equipped to answer that question, and it's something that I take very seriously. I'd like to remind my colleagues that this committee has jurisdiction over environmental research, development and commercial application of energy technology. We also have jurisdiction over the scientific issues related to environmental policy. And we're here today discussing whether it's feasible to deploy alternative energy technologies nationwide. So that is absolutely within the jurisdiction of the subcommittee. And I'd also like to highlight that many of the technological advances we're going to be discussing today came about as a result of the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grants that are directly within the jurisdiction of this committee. So, very apropos to what we're going to be discussing. And then lastly, has been raised that this might be a state issue, and so it might not be appropriate to have a hearing at the federal level. I think that is untrue for two reasons. First of all, the fact that what we're discussing is a request by CARB of the EPA to grant a waiver, which is a federal issue. But the second larger issue is that we are talking about the topic of the regulation of railways and of emissions of locomotives that is already federally preempted. And we're going to be discussing the dangers of allowing 50 different state regulations to exist concerning the emissions of diesel locomotives and the impossibility of having a national freight network when every time you crossed a state line you had to change locomotives. So I take those jurisdictional issues that were raised by my colleagues very seriously. That is why I felt that this hearing was very appropriate. So I want to move into our witness testimony. Our first witness is Mr. Ian Jeffries, who is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of American Railroads. Mr. Jeffries, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fucci, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, where I have the privilege of representing the nation's freight railroads. And through $21 billion in annual private investments and a 140,000-mile interstate network, rail touches most of the economy and facilitates our modern way of life. Railroads provide the greenest form of land transportation, moving 40% of long-haul freight, yet accounting for only 2% of transportation emissions and less than 1% of total emissions. Further reducing our environmental footprint is a core business goal. And as such, I relish the opportunity today to discuss CARB's in-use locomotive regulation, which seeks to begin phasing out diesel locomotives by 2030. Now, doing so requires the EPA to grant a waiver request, which is now under review. CARB's regulation is unrealistic and, frankly, diverges from this administration's Department of Energy's recent budget requests, which includes funds to support a 50% reduction in GHG emissions in a locomotive engine by the year 2030. I must state the obvious clearly. EPA must reject CARB's request immediately and consider the following 3 points. First, the measure clearly violates both the Clean Air Act and interstate commerce laws set by Congress. The former prohibits states from regulating new or remanufactured locomotives, recognizing that railroading is a national process operating across all states. Congress reserved this job solely for the federal government. Second, the CARB regulation is impractical, mandating non-viable technologies on an unrealistic timeline while grossly underestimating the cost of the regulation, not merely for railroads, but businesses that rely on rail as well. Lastly, the EPA waiver approval would create a de facto national regulation that would slow interstate rail traffic and worsen inflation. Nearly 70% of the national locomotive fleet operates in California at some point. And some other states would be allowed to copy the regulation if approved. And we cannot have a patchwork of laws across this state governing what is the essential interstate form of commerce. With that said, allow me to briefly address the landscape for further emissions reductions and the pitfalls of CARB's rule. Consider first that railroads today can move a ton of freight nearly 500 miles on a single gallon of diesel. And this is about 3 to 4 times more efficient than over-the-highway freight. Building on their strong records, rail carriers are actively piloting and testing new technology for their locomotive configurations. However, as locomotive OEMs have made clear, they are not close to widespread commercial availability. Current battery hybrid locomotive technology, for example, generates a fraction of the power needed to replace diesel. The picture grows even muddier when considering the challenges of building out the necessary charging network. Manufacturers are also making progress in developing ZE electric switcher locomotives used in ports and yards to sort traffic. This technology is in its infancy, and orders for beta models have been significantly delayed. Yet CARB expects these to be the exclusive locomotives operating in yards in less than 6 years. Even further, CARB's rule would require railroads to deposit millions annually into an escrow account beginning in 2026. For the 2 Class I railroads that operate in the state of California, that equates to about $800 million per year per railroad. And for smaller carriers, around $5 million per year. Economics 101 says rail transportation costs will be affected. Inflationary pressure would shift freight to the highways, increasing emissions, increasing congestion, and furthering damage to publicly owned infrastructure. A review of the public record shows that the threats are real and understood for many key U.S. sectors and workers. From farmers to chemical shippers to retailers to organized labor, the record overwhelmingly opposes this rule. And the U.S. Surface Transportation Board, which has primary jurisdiction over the national rail network, has even voiced concerns that CARB rule circumvents existing federal law. We are encouraged to see the leadership of Chair Obernolte and so many congressional colleagues in writing to the EPA on a bipartisan basis to express concern. This input should be instructive to the EPA. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Our second witness is Mr. Chuck Baker, President of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association. Mr. Baker, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I am Chuck Baker, President of the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association, representing the nation's 600 small Class 2 and 3 shortline freight railroads. Shortlines are the first and last miles of the freight rail network. We move industrial, agricultural, and energy products from ports, factories, and farms to and from the larger Class 1 railroads, where they bring the goods to and from national and global markets. Shortlines used to be the unprofitable branch lines of the larger railroads. Luckily, following partial deregulation, rather than abandon those lines and rip up the track, the Class 1s sold those lines to local entrepreneurs. Those newly minted short lines didn't have much traffic at the time and weren't in great shape, but the small-town, local folks who took over those lines were eager to make a go of it. They ran as efficiently as possible, focused all their energy on getting just one more new customer or one more carload, and bent over backwards to serve their customers. And it worked. Today, short lines are critical in your communities and pivotal in making sure that the goods that your constituents rely upon can get to their homes and businesses safely and affordably. We manage 1/3 of the freight rail network and touch 1/5 of all carloads, but still only account for about 6% of the industry's total revenue. And we do it all with a light environmental touch. Rail, in total, produces only 1.8% of the transportation system's greenhouse gas emissions and about 0.6% of the nation's total emissions. And short lines are a minuscule fraction of that. The subject of today's hearing, the recent rulemaking by CARB, is a policy overreach of epic proportions that takes direct aim at our critical industry. CARB does get one thing right when it predicts the demise of our industry due to the costs of its measure, acknowledging in its own rule text that if these businesses, and I'm quoting, if these businesses are unable to pass on the cost of the proposed regulation to customers, it is possible that some of these businesses would be eliminated. Well, on behalf of these businesses and the families and communities that rely on them, I am here to sound the alarm. They cannot pass on these costs to others, and when these businesses go bankrupt, the effect will ripple across our supply chain. Short lines move roughly 260,000 carloads of freight in California alone each year, and each carload carries the equivalent of 3 to 4 trucks worth of goods. If short lines are driven out of business due to CARB's infeasible rule, that freight will move onto trucks, and businesses who have lost shipping options will move out of California or just vanish. It's a tortuous trifecta of negative impacts. For rail shippers that rely on a seamless rail network, for the economy as a competitive advantage for American businesses is degraded, and for Americans' quality of life as millions of additional trucks are forced onto the road, increasing congestion, crashes, deaths, taxes for road maintenance, and ironically, greenhouse gas emissions and particulate matter from shredded truck tires. In addition to the dire real-world economic and environmental consequences, we object for two other critical reasons. One, this rule is preempted by federal law. No state should be able to regulate the national rail network, which is what this rule does. 2 centuries of legal interpretations of the Commerce Clause and federal statutes, including ICTA, the Clean Air Act, and the Locomotive Inspection Act, all render CARB's rule illegal. And 2, it's arbitrary and capricious. The rule calls on the rail industry to upend its financial underpinnings to adopt technology that is in its infancy and not ready for prime time. Zero-emission freight locomotives don't exist in a commercially viable form. They aren't at scale, and they don't have the power to do the job needed in harsh railroad operating environments. And even if all of that were magically resolved, they are not remotely affordable for short-line railroads. CARB and short lines do agree that we both want to aggressively move to reduce our already low environmental impact. Our members are engaged in demonstration projects that move our industry closer to a zero-emission reality, including upgrading to cleaner locomotives, trying out alternative fuels, and experimenting with fuel injectors and additives to lower emissions quickly and affordably. In conclusion, Congress can provide leadership going forward in 4 ways. 1, call on the EPA to deny CARB's request, preserving EPA as the regulator of locomotive emissions. 2, continue to fund the CRISI program. Short lines have embraced this tool to move more freight to rail and to upgrade to cleaner locomotives. 3, ensure freight rail remains a key strength of the nation, supporting reasonable regulations focused on proven benefits and avoiding excessive subsidization of trucking. And 4, support the basic R&D activities at the DOE and DOT necessary to advance the economy-wide transition to battery, electric, hydrogen, renewable diesel, and other cleaner power over time in a realistic and affordable fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baker. Our third witness is Mr. Alan Abbs, Legislative Officer of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. Mr. Abbs, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Obernolte, Ranking Member Fushi, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me here today to testify on regulations relating to the public health impacts of locomotive air pollution. My name is Alan Abbs. I'm the Legislative Officer for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, which was created by the California Legislature in 1955 as the first regional air pollution control agency in the nation. The agency is independent from state government and is overseen by a board of 24 locally elected officials throughout the Bay Area. Our role includes regulation of stationary sources of air pollution in the 9 Bay Area counties, from Santa Clara and San Mateo County in the south to Napa and Sonoma in the north. The Clean Air Act defines roles for different levels of government to achieve cleaner air and improve public health through a framework of cooperative federalism. In drafting the Clean Air Act, Congress recognized California's leadership and long history of regulating air pollution from mobile sources, a role that predates the federal statute. Because of this, the Clean Air Act protects California's ongoing right to regulate those emissions, and if California's standards are at least as protective of public health and welfare, federal preemption can be waived. Locomotives are one of the largest sources of health-harming pollutants in California, and the pollution caused by locomotives makes it impossible for California to meet its Clean Air Act obligations. For highly polluted air basins such as the South Coast and San Joaquin, locomotives represent 31% of the reductions needed to meet federal air quality standards under the Clean Air Act. California's Class 1 railroads are the nation's largest in both miles traveled and operating revenues, yet they continue to use and are increasing use of some of the oldest and most polluting engines in California. EPA-compliant locomotives have been available since 2015, but most locomotives operating in California have old emissions control technology that produces 90% more pollution than the current EPA standard. And according to CARB, in the past several years, the average emissions of their locomotive fleets operating in California have been getting worse, not better. In the San Francisco Bay Area, the Regional Air Pollution Inventory has shown that locomotives operations, including road hauling, switching, and rail passenger transportation, contribute approximately 40 tons of toxic air contaminants and 2,200 tons of ozone-causing nitrogen oxides in 2023. In recent years, under California Assembly Bill 617, the district has been working with stakeholders to reduce disparities in air pollution exposures. Technical assessments indicate that locomotives are key driver of cancer risk, with locomotive emissions being of special concern in neighborhoods adjacent to local rail yards. For example, West Oakland is a shorefront community adjacent to the Port of Oakland with related rail yards and 4 active marine terminals. Locomotives operating at these rail yards account for an incremental cancer risk of about 125 additional cancer cases per million, exceeding EPA thresholds for acceptable risk. In Richmond, San Pablo, it's about 100 additional cancer risk. Even in areas that currently attain Clean Air Act standards, pollution from locomotives is a serious public health concern. 90% of California's rail yards are within 1 mile of vulnerable residential communities already highly impacted by traffic pollution, which contains the same contaminants as from locomotives. Until the railroads take serious steps to reduce emissions, these communities will continue to have disproportionately high levels of air pollution and suffer the health consequences. In 2023, CARB adopted a locomotive regulation and, as noted, would result in $32 billion in health savings, prevent 3,200 premature deaths and 1,500 emergency room visits and hospitalizations. It would also decrease the cancer risk from exposure by up to 90% in places. CARB's regulation does not set emission standards on new locomotives. It doesn't mandate the use of zero-emission technologies by 2030 or 2035. Instead, it calls for a steady reduction of emissions over the next 30 years, allowing for existing technologies to be used while new and more advanced zero-emission technologies are developed. Rail providers could make significant strides in meeting these regulatory requirements by just upgrading existing equipment to the 2015 standards. While the regulation does not require the purchase of new emission locomotives, it's worth noting that such locomotives are available for purchase today. Real quickly on incentives, since 2016, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District has provided incentives to upgrade 10 switcher locomotives to current technology, as well as the Caltrain electrification project. While these projects have demonstrated the feasibility, it shows that incentives alone cannot meet this hurdle that we have of getting cleaner locomotives. So, in conclusion, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. I would just point out that zero-emission rail transportation is nothing new. Electrified rail is more than 100 years old and is widely used around the world. Nearly every locomotive operating today runs on fully electric motors, which could be powered other than using diesel generators. And diesel locomotives emit a toxic air contaminant for which there is no known safe level of exposure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Abbs. Our fourth and final witness is Dr. Tyler Dick, professor at the University of Texas, Austin, and lecturer and principal research engineer with the Texas Railway Analysis and Innovation Node. Dr. Dick, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Obernolte, Ranking Member Fushi, and members of the subcommittee, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this important discussion today. My name is Tyler Dick, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Civil, Architectural, and Environmental Engineering at the University of Texas at Austin, where I lead the Texas Railway Analysis and Innovation Node, or TRAIN Lab for short. For the past 12 years, I've conducted research on railway operations and energy efficiency, including the benefits and costs of alternative energy locomotives. The opinions I express on my own do not necessarily represent those of the University of Texas. Railways play an essential role in the U.S. economy as they uniquely combine the speed and energy efficiency to safely move large quantities of freight at low cost. Although U.S. freight railroads continue to improve fuel efficiency, they consume over 3 billion gallons of diesel fuel each year. Despite representing less than 2% of transportation-related emissions, freight railroads, like all of us, must act to reduce carbon emissions in an effort to stem climate change and the health impacts on adjacent communities. However, freight railroads must be allowed to decarbonize at a pace that respects the current state of zero-emissions locomotive technology and in a safe manner consistent with the operational realities of an integrated North American rail network. Unfortunately, the aggressive timeline and scope mandated by the CARB in-use locomotive regulation cause concern on both of these fronts. Although a number of technologies offer the promise of future zero-emissions freight transportation, none of them are currently commercialized for North American heavy-haul freight mainline operations. Each zero-emissions technology has unique technical, safety, and implementation challenges that must be addressed before widespread deployment is possible. Traditional electrification through overhead wire will make the most efficient use of electricity, but requires development of new electric locomotive designs meeting the performance requirements of North American freight operations. Battery electric locomotives have seen limited mainline testing, and thus their long-term range performance under various climate, topography, and operating conditions is uncertain, along with the viability of high-power charging to support economical battery locomotive utilization. Hydrogen fuel cell locomotives, which make the least efficient use of electricity, are only beginning mainline prototype development, and thus our understanding of their long-term performance, durability, and safety is in its infancy. While I am confident that the railroads, railway supply industry, government agencies, academia, and national labs can partner to overcome these challenges, it will require years of further research, development, and full-scale testing of each technology, followed by years of commercialization and deployment. There are numerous historical examples of railway technologies that appeared to be good ideas on paper or in the lab, but failed when rushed to market without proper testing to expose them to the long-term realities of North American heavy-haul freight mainline operations. With its aggressive timelines, the CARB regulation exposes emerging zero-emissions technologies to suffering this same fate. All three zero-emissions options will require expensive investments in energy supply infrastructure, whether that be overhead catenary wire, high-power battery chargers, or hydrogen production and fueling stations. Should a technological pathway prove not to be viable, early investments in associated energy supply infrastructure will become stranded assets. While dual-mode locomotives can help mitigate this risk and reduce infrastructure requirements, they remain an unproven concept in the freight environment and require time for development and testing. Finally, from an operational and implementation perspective, the CARB regulation leaves freight railroads with two undesirable alternatives. The first is to isolate new locomotives to operations within California by having all freight trains stop and swap locomotives at exchange points just outside the state. In 2016, I led a CARB-sponsored study that documented the negative impacts of these exchange points on railway operations, including a potential shift of freight from rail to less efficient trucks. The second alternative is a network-level implementation of a given technology, which is impractical under the mandated timeline and represents a tremendous investment risk given the current state of zero-emissions locomotive technology. The combination of dual-mode locomotives and partial or discontinuous electrification on certain routes, in conjunction with batteries or hydrogen on other corridors, could provide a third implementation pathway, but further research and testing is required to prove the viability of these more flexible concepts and their better fit to railway operating patterns across main lines of different traffic density. Unfortunately, the CARB regulation does not afford railroads the time or flexibility required to achieve this more likely multi-technology scenario in a given timeline. Thank you for the opportunity to participate today. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Well, thank you very much to all of our witnesses. That concludes our witness testimony. We'll move now to the questions and answers portion of our hearing, and I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Jeffries, let me start with a project that is critically important to my district, and it's one I think you're aware of. BNSF has proposed to build a multimodal transfer facility in the city of Barstow, which is in my district. It's going to bring over 20,000 jobs to my community. And the purpose of the facility is to transfer freight from the ports of Long Beach to Los Angeles. Instead of putting them on trucks, which is what happens now, they want to put them on rail cars, put them by rail out to Barstow, and then switch them to other trains going other places in the country. So that would shift the transportation of millions of tons of freight from truck to rail. Now, BNSF has said very publicly that should this proposed in-use locomotive rule become enforced, that they would no longer be able to build this facility in Barstow. And they're in the middle of building it now. They would stop and build it somewhere else because they can't afford to have freight locomotives that can't go into California and have to switch at the state border. Would make the whole system completely nonsensical for them, and I understand that. But help me understand this. It seems to me, from a layman's perspective, that for CARB to take an action that forces the transport of millions of tons of freight by truck that emits 3 times as much greenhouse gases per pound of freight moved instead of rail would be completely nonsensical and the opposite of the goal that they're trying to achieve. Am I missing something there?
You're not missing anything, and it's completely counterintuitive to CARB's overarching goals. And these are the types of projects that we should all be celebrating and championing. This is a $1.5 billion project, be the largest intermodal yard in the country, all done with private dollars, not public dollars. And to your point, taking thousands of trucks off a very congested corridor, putting it on rail, getting it out of the LA basin into an area to sort for long haul across the country. It's exactly the sort of thing we should want to see happening, and it would be such a missed opportunity if this project were put at risk because of this rule.
And to amplify the point, that corridor that you're referring to that is currently heavily trucked, that's also in my district. And so I have a vested interest in making sure that we shift those emissions to something that's 3 times more efficient. All right, Mr. Abbs, I had a question for you. I was interested in your testimony about the fact that freight locomotives in California were one of the largest emitters of health-threatening pollutants. And that was your oral testimony. In your written testimony, you had a fact that you quoted that said locomotives represent 31% of the pollution reductions needed to meet federal air quality requirements under the Clean Air Act. And that 31% really caught my eye because the statistics that the EPA gave us is that railroads make up less than 2% of transportation emissions and only about 0.05% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. So can you tell me where that 31% statistic came from? Because I'm having trouble reconciling it.
Yes, Chair. Thank you for that question. So that number comes from from CARB's state SIP that they turned in for the 2022 SIP standard. So it represents the difference in emissions that that California would need to achieve to meet 2037 Federal Clean Air Act requirements for particulate and NOx.
All right, well, I'm going to have to chase down why those numbers are so different because that seems to counter to the data that the EPA is giving us. And Tyler, let me conclude here. I've got a minute left here. One of the arguments for completely electric zero emissions locomotives is that even if it's not possible to pack enough energy into batteries in a locomotive form factor, it is possible to just have tenders that are towed behind the locomotive with more and more batteries. And even if you need 10 of those tenders to do the job of one diesel locomotive, that's feasible. But you know, that's the argument. Do you see some merit in that? Is that true? Or is that something that you are skeptical about?
Well, that's something that my research group has been actively looking at. Well, technically feasible to couple up as many tenders as needed to provide the battery power. There is the operational consideration of train length. So in the United States, roughly 70% of the primary principal mainline corridors are single track lines. It's going to only have one train operating at a time. And these trains pass each other at very short sections of double track called passing sidings. And the length of those passing sidings can limit the length of a freight train. So anytime you take away that available length of a freight train and consume it with battery tenders or tenders of any sort, you're going to be reducing the potential number of rail cars that can be transporting revenue-earning freight on those trains. And by doing that, you're not only earning less revenue per freight train, but you're also transporting less freight and making them overall less efficient. So there's an efficiency penalty dictated by the maximum train length that tenders impose on the network and operations.
Right. All right, thank you. I'll now recognize Ranking Member Fucci for 5 minutes for her questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We must not forget that this issue at its core is about human health and human life. Mr. Abbs, you testified that in the community of Richmond-San Pablo, rail activities increase the risk of cancer by 20%. Meanwhile, CARB estimates that the rule would decrease cancer risk in communities around major rail yards by over 90% by 2045. Environmental justice communities bear the true costs of polluted air, so they must be centered in any discussion about costs and benefits for policies such as this. So my first question is, can frontline communities near rail yards in the Bay Area hope to achieve healthy air quality standards without significant reductions in freight rail emissions?
Thank you for your question, Ranking Member. So the simple answer is no. We've done significant work in frontline communities, especially over the last 10 years, communities such as West Oakland, Richmond, San Pablo, that have, as I mentioned, locomotive operations, port traffic, a lot of industrial facilities. It takes effort in a lot of those areas to get reductions, to even get those frontline communities down to the risks of the rest of the Bay Area that doesn't have those industries nearby. But locomotive operations and getting those cancer risks down through increased locomotive regulations is absolutely critical to get even close to what we would like to see in the frontline communities.
And it's very common for industry to claim that ambitious new air quality standards are impossible to meet and new technologies are immature and infeasible. But time and time again, new standards are enforced, our environment becomes cleaner, and the sky does not fall. How does the industry's resistance to rail decarbonization mirror other sectors' reluctance to adopt previous air quality standards? And should past experience make us optimistic about industry's ability to adapt to this rule?
That's a good question. So our primary role as a stationary source regulator means that the Bay Area AQMD routinely tightens or strengthens regulations on sources of industrial pollution, and we do find, as you say, every time we'd like to strengthen regulations to lower emissions, the first argument is that it's not achievable, it's not cost effective. We're going to leave the Bay Area, we're going to leave California, but time and time again, what we've seen in California in general, we've managed to increase the state's GDP, become the fifth largest economic powerhouse if we were a country, and we've done that by making California cleaner. And so I think we can do both, and this regulation would definitely get us in that right direction.
Thank you for that. Mr. Dick, thank you also for your testimony today. As this is a Science Committee hearing, we always appreciate the presence of technical experts, and we have a firm commitment to scientific transparency. Your publication history shows that you've authored or co-authored at least 37 papers since publishing your dissertation. How many of these papers were funded in whole or in part by the Association of American Railroads?
Yes, thank you. I'd estimate that depending on the particular topic, most of my papers particularly focus on railway operations, so approximately half of those publications would have had some high-level partial support when I was at the University of Illinois from the Association of American Railroads through gifts to the academic program there that are given at a very high level.
By my count, roughly half of your academic research papers, as you've noticed, have been funded by industry, and the primary source of that industry funding has been AAR. In fact, you even thanked AAR for your support in your dissertation itself. I want to be clear. Industry-funded research is not inherently problematic, and I respect your expertise. However, I think it's important for the hearing record to reflect that your research funding has been highly dependent on support from an organization represented here by one of your co-panelists. The testimony you presented today is closely aligned with AAR's position. That's not a given. There is a wealth of scientific research pointing to the technological feasibility and cost effectiveness of railroad companies switching to cleaner technologies. So I think it's important to note that while 3/4 of the panelists today are coming to identical conclusion, that does not reflect the balance of the full scope of scientific literature on the issue. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I request unanimous consent to include numerous stakeholder letters that the committee has received on this issue into the record. Without objection, so ordered. We'll go next to my colleague from California, Congressman Fong. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could first go to Mr. Jeffries. As the chair noted, rail is a critical component of our supply chain. As you noted in your testimony, California is home to two of the biggest and busiest ports in America, the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach. account for 40% of the goods and products entering into the United States. And these ports are critical for several sectors of the economy, whether it's on the import side, but of course on the export side as well, for especially the farmers in my district. My question is, if the EPA grants this waiver, could you describe in more detail the impact to the supply chain and what it would mean to the national freight rail network?
Well, with the last term you used is key in this, the national freight rail network. Railroading is the original federally regulated industry, given its inherent interstate nature, so things don't happen in a vacuum in one state or the other. That's why this regulation's clearly illegal under federal statute. But one, you're going to, as my colleague said, and I'm sure he'd be happy to elaborate on, you're going to put some smaller railroads out of business. You're going to dramatically increase the cost of transportation by rail, even for the larger railroads, given the $1.6 billion a year that they are going to be paying to the state because they cannot turn their fleet over with a technology that does not exist. I think about this, who has the most business-wise reason to profit from this? It's the OEMs, and it's the OEMs who are making the case that this capability is not out there. And so you're dramatically increasing the cost of transportation. What's that going to do? It's going to push freight onto the highways, increase congestion, increase wear and tear on publicly owned infrastructure, increase emissions, and grind to a halt a lot of the free movement of commerce, not only in California, but in and out the rest of the country. Some of the workarounds we've discussed even at the highest level, literally putting traffic onto trucks to move it into the state because you don't have the locomotive technology. Switching locomotive types if the technology did exist at the state line. That requires a massive amount of build-out of infrastructure. That's additional handling, switching, reducing, increasing transit times, again, making rail completely obsolete when it comes to a customer or a shipper's desire to move goods around the country.
So just as a follow-up, in your assessment as an expert in freight railroads, would it be fair to describe the supply chain impacts as significantly disruptive?
It would be more than fair to describe it that way.
Let me move to Mr. Baker, if you have anything to add to this conversation on supply chain.
I appreciate that. As Ian highlighted, it's a seamless, integrated national rail network, and I represent the Shortline railroads, which are typically the first and last miles. And as CARB even acknowledges in its own rule text, this rule legitimately threatens the viability of Shortline railroads. I try not to come up to Congress and Capitol Hill and speak in hyperbole, but this is an existential threat to Shortline railroads. And if small railroads, which just simply can't afford this mandate on anything remotely resembling the time that's contemplated, if small railroads go out of business, then that freight, it just moves to truck. It either moves out of California, it vanishes, or moves to trucks. And so I would say that's devastating for not only the supply chain, but also the environment, also public safety, also congestion, and also the taxpayer who has to pay for the highway maintenance.
Moving to Mr. Abbs, someone who just came from the state legislature, served on the Select Committee on Ports and Goods Movement, served during the pandemic and the supply chain crisis. My question to you is, how does the state of California plan to mitigate the supply chain disruptions that are likely to arise because of CARB's regulation?
Thank you, Congressman Fong. Welcome to D.C. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you. Like we never left.
So, I'm obviously I'm with the Bay Area Air Quality Management District. I'm not here to talk about CARB's overall strategy with respect to supply chain, and what they foresee the impacts might be as part of this as part of their locomotive regulation.
If I could specify, then you oversee the Port of Oakland. How would you, as your air quality operations, how would it affect the ports there?
Well, so as I mentioned before, we do significant work in and around the Port of West Oakland to try to make that port area cleaner for the residents of West Oakland. There's about 26,000 residents in and around the port, and they've been asking for a cleaner environment for decades. And so work at the port and work at the rail operations related to the port is significant to us. We would love it if we could get to Tier 4 switchers immediately. We would love it if we could get to zero emission equipment as fast as possible. But in terms, and so we'd be definitely hopeful that we can do that. As I mentioned, incentives coming from the Bay Area are not enough, and so we rely on them to meet the requirements of the locomotive regulation to do that.
I've run out of time. I think the concern about cost is what I was trying to get at in terms of how we mitigate these supply chain disruptions. So thank you.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to the ranking member of the full committee, Ranking Member Lofgren. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Abbs, first I want to thank you for the work that you are doing in the Bay Area, making the air in my district more breathable, and by extension, improving the health of my own constituents. Now, in your testimony, you note that locomotives account for nearly a third of the pollution reduction needed to bring highly polluted air basins into attainment of the Clear Air Act requirements. Now, the other witnesses today have come citing much smaller numbers, contextualizing locomotive emissions as a portion of total U.S. emissions or sector-wide emissions. Can you please explain this discrepancy? Does pointing to say that 0.6% of total U.S. GHG emissions miss the point when it comes to protecting the public health of frontline communities?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the context that's missing from some of those statements is that it focuses specifically on greenhouse gases. This is the CARB regulation is an air toxic control measure, and so it's designed to get reductions in diesel particulate matter, which is a carcinogen, and also to get reductions in NOx, which is an ozone precursor. So the overall impact of locomotives nationwide may be 2% in terms of GHGs, but really when you look at it, the purpose of the California regulation is to get public health benefits, and to get public health benefits through reductions of diesel particulate and NOx. There is, as the regulation does point out, there are reductions in GHGs that are anticipated, but primarily those health benefits are from the air toxics.
Thank you. That's very helpful in understanding this. Now, in your testimony, you cited the CARB figures estimating premature death, emergency room visits, cancer rates, and those are striking numbers. Can you share what these drastically improved health metrics would mean for residents of the Bay Area, where Mr. Mullen and I represent?
So when you look at health risks in different air basins as part of that locomotive regulation, about half of those costs, those health benefits, come from residents in and around the South Coast locomotive operations. About a quarter of the remaining benefits accrue to the Bay Area, and then the San Joaquin Valley also gets a significant amount of benefits. But between the South Coast, the San Joaquin Valley, and the Bay Area, we get most of about 100% of the benefits, and we have about 100% almost of disadvantaged communities between those three air basins.
You know, we recently had a briefing on the hydrogen hubs in California and the very aggressive plans for the trucking industry in particular to rapidly move that industry into zero emissions. I think that's important when it comes to not only the Bay Area but the whole state, which leads you may not know the answer to this question because you're Bay Area focused in your job, but the children of the Central Valley in California have the highest asthma rate in the United States, and it's from pollution. And I'm wondering if you can identify how much of that would be ameliorated through the rail rule, how much would be ameliorated through the transition to hydrogen hubs in trucking, because I-5 is a major issue in terms of emission. Do you have that information, or do I need to ask someone else?
I don't have that exact information, but I can give you something that may satisfy you, at least for this hearing, and then I'll work on getting you some more information later. CARB did a what they called a truck versus train analysis, where they looked at the pollution disbenefits of transporting a similar amount of goods by train and by truck. And what they've discovered is that in the 2020 to 2024 time period, with the advances that we've made in clean technology for the heavy-duty trucking fleet, a fleet of trucks transporting the same amount as a train has about the same amount of pollution. And so the cleanliness of our trucks have gotten to the point where they're almost cleaner than the same amount of transport by locomotive. And so what we're hoping to do as part of this regulation is truly get those locomotives to be as clean as they claim they are.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, but any information you can provide on the questions after this hearing would be greatly appreciated. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlewoman yields back. We will go next to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Babin. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and your testimony. I also serve on transportation and infrastructure, and this very morning we were talking about the emissions, the new emissions rule coming down in California. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that the California Air Resources Board acknowledged that their rule would potentially bankrupt the shortline industry, and stated that it is possible that some of these businesses would be eliminated if they fail to comply with the rule. CARB sees the elimination of a critical player in the supply chain as a cost of doing business. Can you speak to the unique nature of shortline business practices and why meeting CARB's mandate by 2035 is not feasible because of its potential crippling effects?
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. The unique nature of short lines, which I know you're very familiar with from your time on the T&I committee, the origin story of short lines really is we're keeping lines viable that are really on the margins, right? We got them from Class 1 railroads in the first place because they didn't make any money, and we've done everything we can to run as lean, as efficiently as possible, try to get one more customer, try to do everything we can for existing customers, and it's widely considered a pretty good American success story that most agencies we've encountered would like to double down on and improve, but CARB's rule contemplates such a dramatic exponential increase in how much we would have to pay for locomotives and motive power that it would put us out of business, and that's so obvious that they had to acknowledge it themselves in the rule. And then, from our point of view, the consequences of that are relatively obvious, but if we're out of business, that freight can't move by rail anymore, and that destroys the seamless integrated rail network. That's bad for the economy, that's bad for the environment, it's bad for public safety.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jeffries and Mr. Baker, you all touched on this in your testimonies, but if this misguided policy goes into effect, what will the impacts of this rule be on constituents outside of the state of California and on supply chains across the country?
Maybe I'll take a first crack, and Chuck can clean up my mess. There is no such thing as a one-state regulation when it comes to the interstate rail network. That's why there's such strong federal preemption in law, because, as I mentioned in my opening statement, nearly 70% of our locomotive fleet moves in and out of the state of California in any given year. And so what does that do? One, at the very base case scenario, this rule dramatically increases the cost of providing rail transportation and most likely shifts a lot of freight onto the highways. And so what does that do? It makes our customers pay more. It makes consumers pay more. It adds stress to the public infrastructure by pushing more trucks, more traffic onto the highways, increasing congestion, impacting the daily consumer. Mr. Obernolte and I just talked about the desire to get trucks off the highway and onto the rail. If you want to reduce emissions right now, let's get trucks off the highway onto the rail, 3 to 4 times more efficient when it comes to that. And so, you can't understate the impacts across the board.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Baker.
He said that very well. I would note that there is a long history, for better or for worse, of other states copying CARB's rules. So if this rule goes into effect, if EPA approves it, I think we could expect some number of other states, maybe around 10 or 15 is a reasonable estimate, who would copy this rule and make it even more national. But I would say California is so big, and nobody would dispute that. California is so big, a California rule is essentially a de facto national rule as it affects the interstate rail network. So all the problems we've talked about that would come in California would be, you'd see nationwide very quickly.
Thank you very much. Less than half a minute. Mr. Baker, it seems like the California Air Resources Board is choosing winners and losers here. If they are able to move ahead with this rule, short-line railroads look to be slated for the losers list. Can you talk about, just for a second, why short lines in particular are not going to be able to comply with CARB's compliance deadline and what it means for short lines around the country?
Appreciate that question. Going back again to the origin story of short lines and how we have to really make a small business try to run as efficiently as possible. A typical short line is buying a used locomotive, maybe about $100,000. They tend to make them last 40, 50, 60 years. The idea of a rule that would say no locomotive older than 23 years old can run in California is, if it weren't so serious, I would almost say it's laughable. But I mean, I say that to shortline railroads and they look at me with disbelief, like, well, all of our locomotives are older than 23 years old.
Okay, thank you. Now my time's up. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to my colleague from California, Congressman Mullen. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and nice job on the baseball field last night.
I'm not going to be commenting on that at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for coming today. Appreciate your testimony. In particular, Mr. Abs, for coming to share how your office improves the lives of Bay Area residents, including those in my district in San Mateo and San Francisco counties. And first, I want to start by saying I've long been a proponent of reducing emissions on railroads. I was one of the many leaders involved in the nearly finished effort to electrify the Caltrain corridor, which runs through my district. This has taken dozens of diesel-powered locomotives off the rails, reducing emissions for residents and providing faster and more frequent service. And while Caltrain is a localized issue on a commuter rail service, railroads across the state continue to contribute to greenhouse gas emissions that should be phased out as quickly as practicable. I am sympathetic to the industry's concerns over cost and timeline. Yet CARB's rule provides flexibility to ensure the industry remains viable and the transition is realistic. And without such regulations, communities like mine and many others are the ones who pay the cost in dirty air and in the impacts of climate change, such as sea level rise. And as my colleague said earlier, these costs are dramatically higher than the upfront investment that industry will make to adopt clean rail technology. So my question, Mr. Abs, in your firsthand experience, what are the costs that Bay Area communities are paying when it comes to living with air pollution and the consequences of climate change, including sea level rise? In other words, what's the cost of doing nothing compared to the cost of transitioning to cleaner locomotives?
Thank you for that question, Congressman Mullen. So just before I answer that, I'll just also note that the Caltrain electrification project, hopefully starting up in September this year, replacing 75% of the trains, will yield a GHG benefit, but that's because they're going to zero-emission trains. So 176,000 tons per year of GHGs, 2 million tons by 2040. Your question on the risks of or the costs of doing nothing. The last 10 years in California, we have rarely gone a month during the summertime when we haven't had extreme wildfire smoke from wildfires, orange skies. California delegation members realize that in recent years, other parts of the U.S. have woken up to problems that we've been dealing with in California for decades now. Sea level rise, obviously, it's a big deal in the Bay Area because we're pretty close to the sea, and we have airport, we have San Francisco, which is looking at potentially billions of dollars to stabilize themselves from sea level rise. We have Highway 37 that we need to figure out a way to keep that high enough to withstand high tides. And so the cost of doing nothing in the Bay Area is substantial, and so that's why going to zero emission as part of that locomotive regulation is going to have some serious long-term benefits for the Bay Area.
Thank you for that. And as you mentioned in your testimony, the Air District was the first regional air pollution control agency in the nation. It predates the Clean Air Act. And given that, there's a decades-long history of navigating the puzzle of local, state, and federal air pollution regulations for the benefit of anyone breathing California air. So can you please describe the Air District's role and its limitations when it comes to addressing air pollution in the Bay Area, and how does its authority differ from CARB's?
Thank you for that question. So the Bay Area Air District, primarily we deal with the stationary source regulation. But at the same time, every air district in California has to meet certain Clean Air Act standards, the attainment standards for ozone, different forms of particulate, and other criteria pollutants. And so while air districts can regulate stationary sources, a lot of the pollution that we see that affects those Clean Air Act standards come from sources which the Air District really has no authority over. And so what you may have seen over the last several years is air districts like the San Joaquin Valley Air District, the South Coast Air District, the Bay Area Air District have been very strong advocates for actions at the state level and at the federal level to reduce mobile source pollution, because without those reductions, most of California cannot meet Clean Air Act attainment standards. There's 36 counties in California right now that are in non-attainment of the federal ozone standards.
Thank you for that, and I'll just conclude by mentioning that it's my understanding that the EPA made it clear in November of 2023 that CARB indeed has the authority to regulate locomotives. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Abbott, you just brought up an interesting point about the ocean rising. How much has it risen in the last 50 years?
I'll have to get back with you on that, Congressman.
Not significant amount, obviously, 50 years. Since 1970, what's the carbon emissions, the carbon content of the atmosphere? Is it greater or less than what it was in 1970?
Could you repeat that question again?
The carbon content, carbon dioxide levels in the entire Earth atmosphere, was it greater or less than it was in 1970?
I would say greater.
You care to state that, bet money on that?
I'll let you answer the question either that I'm right or wrong.
Okay. And what percentage of the atmosphere is made up of carbon dioxide? Percentage atmosphere?
It's a little over 400 parts per billion.
So 0.04%, right? Of that, how much comes from human beings? About 11%. Of that, how much comes from the United States? 14%. Of that, how much comes from trains in the United States? 0.5%. So we're talking about eliminating 0.00003% of the Earth's atmosphere carbon dioxide. That's what we're talking about. Is that a negligible effect when it's compared to nitrogen, 71%? Yes, thank you. So I love science. I love science. Let's talk about science, no, not as a religion, but as science, because that's what this is about. And how much heat is produced when we have to produce massive amounts of electricity. That's what this is about. Do we want to hamstring ourselves by spending trillions of dollars based on some California code of a religion of carbon dioxide? Georgia's ports, along with the intertwined railroads and highways, and I'd say Georgia's famous for its railways for a long time now, are the epicenter of both Georgia and the southwest U.S. economy. Ironically, Georgia typically benefits from California's outrageous regulations because we get a lot of business that move to our state because of it. However, California's Air Resource Board's CARB latest rule to make freight rail zero emissions jeopardizes the interconnected freight rail network. Meanwhile, the EPA's own study stated that freight railroads contribute to what did I say, 0.5%. 0.5% of the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. I already talked about the negligible effect we began with. And if you, matter of fact, if you eliminate all the cars' emissions in the United States, 0.000167%, in case you were wondering, is how much of the atmosphere we're talking about. Negligible. Guys, that's science. If California received this waiver from the EPA for the proposed rule, it would allow California to dictate the emissions policy for the entire country at devastating economic impact. What can we spend that money on? If you want to have a scientific discussion about how we save the earth, don't start with that. Because, by the way, based on a Senate scientific study, Pluto, Mars, Jupiter are all heating too. Is it because of their carbon emissions? Of course not. Let's have a real scientific discussion about climate change. This is what's driving me crazy, guys. When we have these conversations, Mr. Jeffries, can you further explain how California decision would impact railroads, supply chain, and military bases in Georgia?
Well, because we operate a nationwide interconnected network, whatever happens in California, whatever regulations in California are effectively national regulations because 70% of our locomotives move in and out of the state of California. And I should just point out that maybe most folks on this committee may not be aware, but we are self-funded. We fund all of our own infrastructure, all of our own investments to the tune of about $21 billion a year. This is not coming from the federal government. These are business decisions that we are making. And so it has
unfunded mandates, right?
Absolutely.
Love it when the government does that. Mr. Baker, in your testimony, you mentioned that the California Air Resource Board acknowledged that their rule would potentially bankrupt the short-line industry and stated that it is possible some of these businesses would be eliminated if they failed to comply. California sees the elimination of critical player in the supply chain as a cost of doing business. It's crazy. The Georgia Northeast Railroad is a Class 3 short line that runs through my district. Can you speak to the unique nature of the short line business practices and why meeting California's mandate by 2035 is not feasible?
Yes, sir. The Georgia Northeastern Railroad is a great example of a typical short line, but they're maintaining lines in small towns in rural America that are marginal, frankly, that otherwise are at risk of not existing. And to do that, they have to run efficiently, smart, and clean. And so they do everything they can to get cleaner, including upgraded to cleaner locomotives when they can, but they just can't afford this mandate. It would force many of them out of business in California, and if it went national in Georgia too.
So with that, I'm going to rest my case that this is not based on science. This is based on California's religion that doesn't have any effect on the outcome of the atmosphere, that there is global climate change, but it's not due to trains. We don't need to put businesses out of order and change everything based on California's idea that they're going to fix the world with electronic trains. I'm sorry. With that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. We'll go next to the gentlewoman from New York, Congresswoman Tenney. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you to our witnesses today. I just want to first go to Dr. Dick and ask you, you were earlier asked about funding for your research. It was alluded to or suggested that your research is tainted. My understanding that your research has also been funded by the federal government. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Just to go back and looking back over my funding history, roughly maybe 5% of my total funding was received from the Association of American Railroads. Majority of my funding related to alternative energy locomotives was received from CARB itself, the Federal Railroad Administration, and also the Department of Energy Advanced Research Projects Agency Energy, ARPA-E, on several AFTU projects on that front. The vast majority of my funding on the alternative energy locomotive stuff has come from DOE and FRA and not from the Association of American Railroads.
Those sound pretty independent to me. Thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying that, because it does, your record does show that you actually do indeed get funding, as you just stated, from the California Air Resources Board itself. So this is the rule that we're contesting here. And I just want to say, just ask you again, now you, can I just get a little bit about your background? So my question to you, Dr. Dick, is it says you've been studying civil engineering and railways since 1999. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How about Mr. Jeffries? You've been involved in rail issues since 2009 and served in the Inspector General's office at the Department of Transportation. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Baker, You have been involved in rail issues since 2004, is that correct?
That's right, 20 years.
Okay, Mr. Abbs, I couldn't find anything in our research in your bio on railroads or rail systems. Have you ever worked on a railroad or for the rail industry?
No, I have not.
Okay. Did you study railroads or any of these issues with peer-reviewed studies like Dr. Dick and some of the other men sitting here?
No, I haven't.
Okay. So this hearing is about the proposed California Air Resources Board, I'll call it CARB. Don't like to talk about carbs, I don't know. What this regulation will have on the National Rail Network, not on environment and pollution control. It seems to me that you're more of an environmentalist and not so much an expert on railways, and makes you kind of like an odd witness for this, because your expertise is not on how to conduct railroads more successfully. Is there anything that in this regulation that you have done, or anything that deals with railways, not environment, in terms of what this regulation would be about?
Again, I have no experience with railways.
So I know this question has probably come up, and we've been in and out of here, but I want to just say, do you know what percentage of U.S. freight is transported on railways?
No, I do not.
Okay, it's 40%. I think somebody talked about that earlier. So this is an easy one for you, Mr. Abbs, because I know Mr. McCormick, or Dr. McCormick just explained this to you, but what percent of the U.S. greenhouse gases are caused by railroads?
I believe the number was 2%.
0.5%, I think, was the correct answer. Would you agree with that?
I'll take your word for it.
Thank you. Okay. What percent of U.S. transportation greenhouse gases are caused by railroads? I think Dr. McCormick went over this. He's a Marine too, so he's Marine and Dr. McCormick. He's got a lot of titles. And scientist. The answer is 1.7%. I believe that was asked. So if 40% of freight is transported by railways, and yet they only account for 1.7% of transportation-related greenhouse gases, why would CARB target railways instead of, say, the trucking industry?
Yes, thank you for that question. So CARB has done extensive regulations with the on the trucking industry with respect to California, and as I mentioned earlier in questions, has done a truck versus train analysis on a load, equivalent load on a train versus a truck, and found that in the 2020 to 2024 time period, the particulate matter and NOx emissions from
let me reclaim my time, and just because I'm running out of time, but I know that there's this vision and a need to magically transform us into complete electric. I come from the state of New York, very similar to a regulatory regime that we have in California. And I worry about what could happen in a state like New York with we can get 5-6 feet of snow in just a 24-hour period from the lake effect snow from either Lake Erie or Lake Ontario. It would be catastrophic, it would be dangerous, and people would die, including school children are now being forced to be on electric buses in the state of New York with policies that are just only focused on electricity and only on electrification and not on safety, science, and those things. And that's what worries me, is that we have to look at the realities of what we're dealing with people and children and our communities that we serve. And that's why I feel like someone with an expertise in railways, transportation, and all these things, maybe with your background mixed in with that would be more suitable, but you don't seem to have that background as far as dealing with the practical aspects of railways. So with that, my time's expired, I believe. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses.
Gentleman yields back. That concludes our question and answer period. I want to thank all of the witnesses for your valuable testimony and all of the members for the questions. The record will remain open for 10 days for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is now adjourned.